I've been just taking you through reading the Bible, okay? And we've been talking about how there are things that are getting lost in translation, and there are things that we actually just kind of skip over when we read, even when we read it in English. And we don't really pay attention to these things. A lot of times, a lot of it's because of the familiarity of the stories, right? We grew up with flannel graphs of the stories, so we don't need the grammar, is kind of how it comes. And if you've ever taken a new subject, kind of the approach that you should take in reading any book is to learn the grammar first. So you read through it, you learn the language, learn what it's saying, see how the things are kind of put together, and then you go back and you reread it and you start looking for like the author's points. Okay, and so none of you are going to be going back to school anytime soon, but that's kind of how you do it, right? And the same thing should happen with the Bible. Only we know it so well that, or we think we do, that we sort of do it a disservice by just acting like, well, yeah, I know that story, right? And in addition to the myriad of things that get lost in translation, Gabby speaks English and Afrikaans. And there are phrases in Afrikaans that, like, if you put them in English, they make absolutely no sense. You know, and that's just how language works. And I've said this before, that you could, I could give you a sentence like, I have to run to the store because my refrigerator stopped running and my dog has the runs, and if you were a non-English speaker armed with the ability to use the English alphabet and a dictionary, that sentence would make absolutely no sense to you, right? Because you don't know the grammar. And you don't know the fact that run is a word that we use idiomatically. And so this happens in the Bible too, though. There's some sort of bird in the back room. That's actually mine, so it's fine. It's my bird. Yeah, so where was I? We were talking about ancient Syria or something. No. So this stuff, things get lost in translation, people are a bit disrespectful and they call it the telephone game, and that's not what it is. Okay, the Bible has been being interpreted for thousands upon thousands of years. And it starts right away in the beginning, and the Bible addresses itself in some cases, and we've talked about some of these, and we'll get into what we're going to talk about here in a sec. And then in addition to the Bible addressing itself at times, editors address the Bible. And the reason I'm saying that is we're going to find an editor in the chapter today. Okay? So this is just a little icebreaker before we get into our Bible talk. So this isn't necessarily Bible. A man received the following text from his neighbor. "I'm so sorry, Bob. I've been riddled with guilt and I have to confess. I've been helping myself to your wife day and night when you're not around. In fact, more than you. I do not get it at home, but that's no excuse. I can no longer live with the guilt, and I hope you will accept my sincerest apology with my promise that it won't ever happen again." Bob, in complete shock, didn't know what to do. A few moments later, a second text came in, and it said, "Damn spell check, I meant Wi-Fi." That's a funny joke, but it's also like a language joke, because this can happen. Okay, and this happens at times. Did I just lose? Okay, there we go. I guess I'm okay. That tends to happen. If you mute things, it goes off. That was God telling me not to tell that kind of a joke in church. Sorry. No, so this can happen, and, we're not going to get into manuscript studies, thank God, in church, but it happens in some of the manuscripts, okay? And this is just one of those things that whenever a text has a long tradition where it's associated with any religious group, it goes through edits and moments where they're clarifying things, okay? And again, like I said, we're going to see one of those today, and that's why I'm kind of introducing it that way. So we are on Genesis 17, and every man's favorite chapter in the Bible. Yeah, some people know their Bible well enough to laugh at that. And I think today, for the interest of time, I'll just make comments as we go through instead of like reading it and then coming back and then, you know what I'm saying, like we've been doing. So when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and he said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. Now, obviously, this is such a bad translation. So this Almighty God is not what El Shaddai means. Shaddai doesn't mean mighty in the slightest. El does mean God, but Shaddai doesn't mean mighty or almighty. It means something like provider, or in the case of the biblical text, usually what happens is God appears and says, I'm El Shaddai to people who are awaiting children. So it's that kind of blessing in the name. And there's some etymology to it that the word D in Hebrew means something like fecundity or whatever, and so it's the God who grants, that. So then there's also some scholars that say, oh no, this is actually a different deity, and Israel was at one point polytheistic, and I don't think we got to go that route with this because God doesn't say, don't worship these other gods. He just says, hey, I'm that one name. It's fine. I'm your provision. Abraham doesn't have any covenant with God yet. There's no demand to monotheism. The Chaldeans or the people who are being replaced by that name are polytheists. And so it's not a big deal, is what I'm saying, for God to tell Abram his name is something else other than what he's told someone else. Okay? God can basically do whatever God wants. Otherwise not God. But this kind of thing happens throughout the texts of ancient Israel, and in the way that I've kind of summarized it theologically is to say that what Israel is constantly doing is asserting that the name of their God is above the name of all other gods. So it's the name above all names, right? And that theology isn't new to the Bible when Paul talks about it with Jesus. So it's not something Paul invents. And we always have to keep in mind that Christianity would not have survived as a new religion. Okay, it had to be something that was an offshoot of something that already existed. New religious movements didn't exist in the ancient world because your religion had to go back to the founding order. So if you just sprung up and people are like, no, those deities weren't around. We don't worship them. So this is why there's such a connection and why I say you shouldn't really listen to a New Testament scholar who hasn't worked their way through the Old Testament first, because it's just, this is the story that the New Testament is addressing. And there are some other things that we don't have, and that makes it even harder. So if you just jump into the New Testament and you start reading, you're like, well, what is he talking about? Why does he say this? And it's prophetic. No, it's not. He's addressing a known writing. It just doesn't happen to be in our Bible. Okay, that was verse 1. I am El Shaddai, walk before me and be blameless, so that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell upon his face and God spoke with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant shall be with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Your name shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. Abraham doesn't mean anything different than Abram. Okay, this is just how the author is explaining why people in their time call him Abraham, but there's oral tradition that knows him as Abram. So let's just throw a change in. God changed his name, that's why. Well, why do I know him as Tim and everybody else calls him, Timothy? Well, God changed his name, that's why. That's kind of what they're doing here. And I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make you a nation, and kings shall go out from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and between your offspring after you, throughout their generations, as an everlasting covenant, to be as God for you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land in which you are living as an alien, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting property, and I will be to them as God. Now, one thing we've talked about here is the leapfrogging of endpoints in the Bible, and so that Genesis 1 to 11 is about the flood, but there are other things going on in there, right, that are bringing you to the flood and beyond it. There are place names and people names that are kind of thrown in there to get you thinking in a negative way about people from a different area. Okay, and so there's always other things in sight as the editors are piecing this all together. And we've got to always remember, these books weren't even kept as books until our side of Jesus. And most of the Jewish books still aren't. They're scrolls. They weren't connected to each other. You don't read one after the other. Okay, you read one and that's that. And so what they're continually doing is like leapfrogging these points in so that there's a reason for the invasion of Canaan come Joshua. Okay, so we're all the way back in Genesis. We're 4 books away from Joshua. Okay, but the conquest is ever in sight. Okay? And God said to Abraham, "Now as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations." Now this is a little bit different than the covenant with Noah that we saw earlier. I mean, Abraham's covenant earlier, where God is doing the covenant, right? God's the one that walks it out. It's a covenant of grace. Well, this one, Abraham has something he has to do. "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you." And he's like on the edge of his seat, like, okay, this is going to be good. Because like the last one was this everlasting and he did all the work. I can't wait to see what he does this time. And Jim Gaffigan, he's a comedian, has this joke. And he says the commands of God in the Bible get exponentially harder as they progress. And he says, "Don't eat this tree, build me an ark, cut off the tip of your penis." And this is what's happening, Abram's on the edge of his seat, and he says, "This is my covenant. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Joy. And Sarna points out, the guy that I've been referring to throughout this Genesis stuff, Sarna points out that it's interesting and telling that God doesn't say what circumcision is, which means he knows. He doesn't have to outline the process. Okay, so this isn't something unique to Israel even. This isn't something unique to the God of Israel. This is something that a lot of people did. And here I'm going to just read a note from Sarna and try to just interlay some of the scholarly stuff that we do as we go instead of waiting till the end. So he's saying, and this is kind of a longer piece here, but I'll try and skip some of it so we can get it done quickly. "Not only is circumcision the earliest institution of Israel, its introduction being assigned by our narrative to the time of Abraham, but the text tacitly implies that it pre-existed the patriarch, since it is taken for granted that he understands the procedure to be followed, even though no specific instructions are forthcoming. This should occasion no surprise because circumcision is widely and independently attested in the histories of divergent cultures stretching from Anatolia to Western Sudan, from the Australian Aborigines to the Maasai of East Africa, from the Polynesian cultures to the kingdom of Lesotho in southern Africa. Herodotus reported that the Egyptians practiced circumcision for the sake of cleanliness." Okay, and then I'm going to skip over some stuff here. And the point of this is sort of contra people that act like, oh, well, if you're a Christian, this is still a sign that you have covenant with God, and not really. This is something that a lot of cultures did for various reasons. Some of them were cultic reasons. Some of them were purification reasons. Some, like Egypt, was for cleanliness. They noticed that it was cleaner to do it that way, so they did. And their process of circumcision was different. They didn't remove the foreskin. They just kind of detached it and let it hang. And yeah. And that's just, different cultures did it differently. But what's cool about what the Bible does is it engages the cultures around it. Okay, and we have this idea that the Bible was birthed in like a vacuum. Like in this temple far underground, these rabbis were writing and no one else knew the stories. And no, like they know their story and they're engaging their culture. Okay? So Sarna goes on, he says, "In those cultures that traditionally practice circumcision, the age at which it is performed may vary widely, but the overwhelming preference is at puberty or as a prenuptial rite." Can you imagine, like, you want to get married? Yeah, okay. We got to sign a prenup. Doesn't mean the same thing in your country. Language is important. In either case, it takes place at a crucial period in the male life cycle and marks the initiation of the individual into the common life of his group. So it's a group initiation rite, okay, in the ancient world. The biblical shift to the 8th day after birth is a radical break with existing traditions, severing all connection with puberty, marriage, and rites of passage. This particular dissociation now permits circumcision to be invested with an entirely new and original meaning. The operation owes its sanction not to any natural reason, but solely to its being divinely ordained. In the course of its performance, it derives its significance solely from it being the conscious expression, and my thing just went, doggone it, my notes just took off on me. Conscious expression of the external immutable covenant between God and Abraham. Having been performed, it constitutes the ineradicable token, scholars sometimes, it's like less than 5 letters, please, of the imposition of that covenant upon every generation of his descendants. The religious life of the Jew begins, therefore, on the 8th day of his birth. Since the circumcision is performed on each individual at that age and is not, as is frequently elsewhere, a ritual practiced collectively, there's a report that they have found of an Egyptian community that over 120 men ritually circumcised themselves at the same time in a temple. Yeah, I mean, like, do you go to war after that or do you go home and recover? It's a ritual practically, it underscores the singularity of each Jew's relationship to God. So listen to what he's saying, and we'll kind of repeat some of these. His personal dedication and obligation as a member of a covenanted community. It is the distinguishing mark of Jewish identity, and more than anything else, has proved to be a powerfully cohesive force in the struggle for national survival. So scholars like to say that the Bible demythologizes myth. Okay, and myth is just, in the scholarly world, that just means story. And it doesn't mean false, it doesn't mean true, it can be any combination of those. It's just story. But to demythologize means to kind of take out all of that superstitious aspect to it. Okay, so for the Jews, when they're writing this, when they're not Jews at that time, but when Israel is writing this, they're incorporating a known procedure in the ancient world into their community, and in every way it kind of upsets how that procedure gets men into their communities. You know, it's not done as a prenuptial rite. It's done when they're 8 days old. You know, they don't have to wait to get married. They don't have to wait to be a part of the community. They don't have to wait to be inheritors of the covenant. And all of that against their will when they were 8 days old. Right. You know, so this covenant of free will nonsense, like, doesn't originate in the Bible. Right. You know, it originates with people post in Bible. Right. When they really want to have their own will. So what Sarna is saying here, I'm going to read these real quick. It underscores the singularity of each Jew's relationship to God. So it's this individual act of relationship with God. Okay? It would be like Christians taking communion. Even though we do it collectively, it's still a one-to-one type thing. Although circumcision isn't a sacrament in Judaism. It's a law. So it's different. Like, you just do it because you do it. You know, and it's not, there's nothing, you don't become holier because you did it. You know, sacraments are in some ways meant to make us experience the manifest presence of God and these different kinds of things. That doesn't happen with circumcision. From what I remember, I didn't experience the manifest presence of God. You know, and none of my kids have either. You know, it's just, that's that. And then it kind of signals out the baby's identity as a member of a covenanted community. Okay, and so again, this is important when you're in a world where tribalism is kind of how you live, and you need to be in a community, otherwise you die. Because there are lots of, like, Assyrians and Babylonians and lions and things running around. Okay, so that is that. And we could go on and on about circumcision, and, you know, this is not anything new to the Christian discussion, and Paul kind of does away with it in the New Testament as a matter of Christian right. He doesn't say you shouldn't do circumcision. He says it's not anything for covenant with you guys. You know, it's something that Jews do. And so that's that. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. And at 8 days of age you shall yourselves circumcise every male belonging to your generations, and the servant born in your house, and the one bought from any foreigner who is not your offspring. You must certainly circumcise the servant born in your house, and the one bought with your money, and my covenant shall be with your flesh as an everlasting covenant. And as for any uncircumcised male who has not circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. And that is meant to be kind of a funny play on words. Okay, it's not necessarily, to be cut off from the community, the wages of sin is death, is what Paul says. Okay, to put it in the terms of Genesis 17, the wages of sin is to be cut off from your community. And what is sin here? To not be circumcised. So not being circumcised means cut off from your community. Why? Why would you die if you're cut off from your community? Because there's lions, and there's desert demons named Azazel, and there are, there's all kinds of stuff out there they don't know about. and there are invaders and marauders, and there are pirates, and there are things out there that will get you if you're not a part of a community. So if you're cut off from your community, now there is religious tone to this too, like you're also cut off from the presence of God. But it's really more about the community aspect. So then God says to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife. Now this is important because this covenant, like that kind of only works for guys. That sign, right? The circumcision thing. I mean, that God doesn't ask her to do anything like that. And so he turns to her and he's like, all right, now, as for you, okay? And I think this is important because a lot of people will say things like, oh, the Bible's misogynistic. And it's not really. It's patriarchal, but that's because that's how the societies worked back then. But it's not misogyny. Misogyny means hatred of women. The Bible is not misogynistic. That's dumb. It's very patriarchal. And we should expect that. And it shouldn't shock us when patriarchal era texts use patriarchal language. Just like it shouldn't shock us when Huck Finn uses the N-word. We don't use that word. It's not acceptable. But it's in a book that was written in a time when that was acceptable, and was part of common vernacular. And Mark Twain used it subversively, against the community that used it so much. And so we don't need to get all up in arms about this kind of stuff when we see it. And we just saw, Abram owned slaves. I'm reading in Numbers right now in my morning reading, and there's some pretty nasty stuff going on in Numbers. Where God says, through Moses, kill the young men. And what he means is the young boys, like the young boys. And then in every English Bible, they get it all pretty and they gloss it over and they're like, and take the women for yourselves. That's not what it says. It says, and take the little girls for yourselves. Okay? So, this is how it works. This is how warlike, patriarchal, this is how the world was. Yeah. And if the culture that we are looking at is so radically different from everything that surrounds them, you're looking at fiction. But you know what? They're like the cultures that surround them. And they get addressed for that. So God said to Abram, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, for Sarah shall be her name, which also means nothing. It's another modernization of an ancient name. You can make an argument that Sarai means my princess or something like that, and Sarah just means princess. So there's that, but that's a really weak argument. And I will bless her. Moreover, I will give to you from her a son. And I will bless her. Again, he says it. And she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. And we don't have time, but there's a lot of really formulaic language in this that you can go look at other covenants that are made between deities and their cultures. And a lot of this kind of language is there, and the repeating of, and I will do this, and I will do that. And so is that God? Is that formulaic language? Deal with that how you shall. She shall give rise to nation. Kings of peoples shall come from her. And Abraham fell upon his face and laughed. Come on. That's about the best response. This is why I love the Hebrew Bible. The people are real. I'm 100. And like Zechariah, though, he doesn't throw his wife under the bus. Remember John's dad, who's like, have you seen my wife? She is ancient in years. And Abraham first says, I'm 100. And then he says, or can Sarah bear a child at 90? So he does her a solid by putting himself up first and saying, I'm too old for this. And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, Ishmael kind of means to stand before God or to live before God or to hear before God, and it's idiomatic. And so El is the name God, right? You know that? And God says, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Yitzhak. So it says Isaac, and that's a really bad way to say it, because Yitzhak means laughter. Oh, nice. It doesn't mean Isaac. Isaac is the anglicized version that we use, but it's Yitzhak. Everywhere else you see this tzadeh letter, they change it to a Z, but here they change it to an S. And it really just means he laughs. It's a verbal form, and God's like, fine, you're going to laugh at me? I'm like, you're going to name your kid after what you just did. So God says, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear a son for you, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant to his offspring after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Now, anybody who has any issue with the Israelite-Palestinian thing that's going on right now, get over it, okay? Because this is, both people groups in the Bible are covenanted by God, okay? Their ancestors are, and told that they're going to be great and blessed and all that. So we don't need to get into a big political discussion, but we're gonna. No, but ancient Hebrew is not the same thing as Israelite, is not the same thing as Jew, is not the same thing as Israeli. Okay, those are names that kind of progress through time. And Hebrew was kind of like outcast, really, is what it meant. I mean, that's a really bad thing. It didn't mean that, but it was used in a pejorative way at times. Okay? Israelite is only after the monarchy with David. So it is like way. Before that, they're always called the B'nai Yisrael, which means the sons of Israel. Okay, and so that's a guy. It's not a country. Israelite has to come around after the man named Israel, which means that everybody before him can't be an Israelite. They have to be Hebrew or something else, and a lot of them are something else. Abraham's something else. He's not Hebrew. Certainly not an Israelite. Jew is the religious group that came around after the destruction, which is thousands of years after Abraham, or at least a couple thousand. And they're the religion of the tribe of Judah. Judaism, Judah. Make sense? And now that's all that was left, so that's the national religion. But we got to understand that there were multiple kind of things going on, right? And we see them, and we don't put two and two together sometimes. Say, ancient Israel was Jewish. No, they weren't. That Judaism comes from them, but they're not the same thing. Some scholars call them Yahwists. But at some point we have to realize that they were building altars on various hills. And they just call them their Baals. But that word means lords, gods. So at some point these groups were worshiping different gods on different hills. So when, that's where you get a lot of these different names, and we can go through a big history lesson later. That's not as important. But so I got off on that tangent. I don't know why. Oh yeah, because of the name Jew and Israel and all that stuff. So when he finished speaking with him, God went up from Abraham. Oh no, I'm sorry. One more verse there. And I will multiply him exceedingly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this appointed time next year. When he finished speaking with him, God went up from Abraham, and that language is to imply that God came down to talk to Abraham, because remember, God is up here somewhere. Who is man that thou art mindful of him? You've made him a little lower than the Elohim, physically, a little lower. That's what that means. It doesn't mean like hierarchically or like we're on like a mountain climbing toward God. It means literally God is somewhere vertically above us and we are down here. Okay, this is how they wrote their cosmology religiously. Like we have fields called astrology. And astrology doesn't bring God into the equation. But their astrology did. Because that's the only way they knew things could have been there, and so God must have done it that way, and so here's why it is. There's 3 questions we can always ask ourselves, and these are pretty much every single Bible verse is addressing one of these 3 questions. Is who am I, who is God, and why did that just happen? And pretty much all 3 throughout the Bible, those are the questions. That's what's going on. You know, if you see a prophecy, the prophecy is, why did that just happen? Okay, and we'll talk about that later. So Abraham took Ishmael his son and all who were born of his house and all those acquired by his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin on the same day that God spoke with him. That is a lot of work for one day and for one guy. And did he personally do it? Philo asks a lot of questions like this. You know, in one day, is Abraham able to personally, individually circumcise every male in his family? And the procedure back then was not like it is now. They had to manually suck the blood out of the wound to prevent infection. Does Abraham do that to all of the men in his household? Okay, so I think, and I'm not trying to be gross, I'm just like, this is where we have to needle down and look at what the Bible's saying. Do we really, really believe? I believe in the flat literal reading of the... No, you don't. Because if you did, this is a really troublesome verse. That's a lot of work for one day, not to mention all kinds of other issues. And that's on the same day that God spoke with him. So that means, like, how long did God talk? Were they busy? Like, were they having brunch? And is God a gabber? Is he one of those that's like, oh, we can go in a minute? So Abraham was 99 years old when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin. That's old for doing that. I think he should have been like, God, I may have 10 or 15 years left. This isn't going to be like a lifelong covenant. Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised on the same day. Oh, I missed that. Ishmael was 13 years old when he circumcised. So it's been 13 years since Hagar, and 13 years since the Bible has said that Sarah mistreated Hagar and said what she did was wrong. And 13 years since God told Hagar, I'm going to bless your baby. And now, as a sign of the same covenant that God makes with Abraham, he makes it with Ishmael. And it even goes as far as to note, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised on the same day. It's like, he's a part of the covenant. And all of his offspring. And all the men of his house, those born in the house and those acquired by money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So, I mean, this is a lot going on. You know, there's not going to be any work getting done on the farm. Nobody's riding a camel for a couple weeks. Let me just get my notes back out. No, I think we said enough about circumcision, thank God. But I do want to talk about the idea that it's kind of an anti-mythology when something like this appears in Genesis. And the creation narratives do it too. They upset a lot of mythological points that are being made. And, you know, God doesn't have a creation. God just is. That's anti-mythology. God doesn't say something. God doesn't say, light become. God says it and it is becoming as he's saying it. And so it's like there's just subtle differences. But even in something seemingly violent and covenantal and legalistic like circumcision, there is a demythologizing going on where, you know, where people aren't able to be shunned by their community. Why? Because it's already happened. You know, it happened when you were a baby. You don't have any choice in the matter. You're a part of this community. We're going to care for you. And you're going to be a part of our covenant. And part of their covenant involves all the stuff we hate from Leviticus. That's like, oh, you don't have to follow that. No, you don't have to follow that stuff. But this community did, and that's how they treated each other. And all those laws actually led to pretty fair treatment of one another. And so we don't like it, but we also don't live in an ancient world. And there's some language there that we're going to need to work through, and there's some things in Leviticus that are still used today to badmouth people on the basis of sexuality, and Leviticus doesn't say anything about that. It's talking to a certain community, but we don't like that. So what I want to do now, and then we'll close up, is I like to kind of bring ancient interpreters into the discussion as we're reading through these chapters. And so we've had some stuff from Philo, and we've had some stuff from the Dead Sea Genesis Apocryphon, which is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we've had some stuff from a couple other guys. But the idea is, I want us to understand that the act of interpreting the Bible has been going on for thousands of years, and there is no one interpretation of the Bible. Okay? There is no singular theology. I mean, the reason we have so many debates and fights among Christians right now is because everybody thinks that their theology is whole Bible theology. BS. None of it is. There's no such thing as a whole Bible theology because the Bible corrects itself. I mean, so there are things that are going to hit our theology, and I like to tell people the best way to start reading the Bible is without the obligation of belief. And that doesn't mean I'm going to come to the Bible and say, all these stories are false. What it means is I'm going to come to the Bible and say, okay, I don't believe anything. What does it say? Right? Should only Christians be able to read the Bible? Should only Jews be able to read? Should only Christians be able to read the Bible and get blessed by it? Should only Christians be able to read the Bible and find hope? Or should anybody be able to pick it up and look at it and say, hey, I'm seeing hope here? Yeah. If it's written in that way, then yes. Right? And so we shouldn't get stuck on this idea that, oh no, I have the interpretation. Andrew has the interpretation. Andrew has an interpretation. So does Arthur. So does my dad. So do I. But it's an interpretation. One among many that are all acceptable. The only kind of interpretation that isn't acceptable is when you say, this word doesn't mean that, and I can prove you wrong. That happens. This word doesn't mean murder. Well, actually, no, right here, it says murder. You can't. Run it's called semantic range, right? A word has a semantic range. It's got a range of meanings, but run doesn't ever mean hate. They're not connected, Run always has the idea with the activity of like working in some way, your movement working, that kind of idea. They're all connected somehow. So you can't just go through, and this is why the Amplified Bible sucks, I'm sorry. You can't just go through and look at every word in the sentence and then go look at every possible definition that there could be and pick the one that best suits your theology. But that is what a lot of people do. And I do argue with those people. Because it's just, that's not how no language works that way. You don't get to pick what you want it to mean, and there's always a context. Yeah, that's good. And the sentence is the first context, and then the book is the next context, and then the culture is the next context. And I mean, we got about 50 contexts before we arrive at my own. So if I'm taking my own into that, I'm saying, see, now this, that doesn't work. And it doesn't work for things that make it uncomfortable for us in the grace movement either. But what we have to learn to say, we've been saying this for years, but what we have to learn to do is say it a little more comfortably. I'm comfortable not believing that part. Or not subscribing to that. I'm comfortable not subscribing to the law in Deuteronomy that allows a rapist to own his victim. I don't need that as a part of my way of living life. But I can also, I can read that and I don't need to, go through and make this big apologetic for why it doesn't actually, it means that. It's an ancient culture. They had weird laws. And some of those laws were not very just. The justice in that law is that a woman who was not a virgin could never get married. And so they just forced the rapist to marry her. Okay, fine. You're going to take that from her, you have to provide for her. That's not much justice, but it's better than leaving her on her own for the rest of her life. in an ancient world with pirates, no, with all the things that were there. So this is an interpretation that is done by some rabbi. It's from Targum Neophiti. And there are about 6 Targums that are fairly well known. And Targums are Aramaic translations of the Bible. And today we have commentaries. And what a commentary is it's someone who takes the Bible and they do an English translation, and then they write, as a separate part of the book, a commentary on their translation and how they came to the points that they came to, and all the grammar and all that. Well, in the Targums, they kind of just did that along the way. So you'd see biblical text, and then just boom, there's this comment. And if you don't know the biblical text, you don't know where it's breaking in and commenting and where it's biblical text. So people are like, oh, you shouldn't read the Targums. No, like the guys who read the Targums, they knew the Bible so well that they knew where the interpretation happened. And so they could just read through and go. Okay? So this is going to be verses 1 through, I think, 10 of what we just read, but it's from Targum Neophiti. And then we're going to read something else, and you're going to see where this kind of fits into what we do. When Abram was 99 years, the Memra of the Lord was revealed to Abram and said to him, I am the God of the heavens. Serve before me in truth and be perfect in good work. And I will set my covenant between me and you, and I will make you very, very powerful. And Abram prostrated himself upon his face, and the Memra of the Lord spoke with him, saying, And as for me, behold my covenant with you, and you shall become an assembly of a congregation of just nations. And your name will no longer be called Abram, but your name will be Abraham, because I have set you as an assembly of congregation of just nations. Okay, I mean, you can see what they're doing here, right? They're kind of idealizing Israel. Okay, it's a congregation of just nations, but it's a congregation of nations. They recognize the tribes that make up their nation, right? And for some reason we think, oh no, all these tribes, they all believe the same thing. All of them, all 12 of them. No. And I will make you very, very powerful, and I will make nations of you. Kings who rule nations will come forth from your loins, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your sons after you throughout their generations as an eternal covenant, to be in my Memra a God for you and for your sons after you. And I will give to you and your sons after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting inheritance, and I will be for them in my Memra a redeemer God. Okay, so you keep hearing this phrase, right? The Memra. And in Aramaic, that means word. So when Abram was 99 years, the word of the Lord was revealed to Abram and said to him, and Memra, though, like it's a personalization. So it's not like a spoken word, it's a word, like Jesus was the word. Okay? And this is actually where, there are going to be some scholars that don't like this, but this is where some people will say that John gets in the beginning was the Logos. Because Logos is Greek for Memra, which is Aramaic for Debar, which is Hebrew for word. This is all translation stuff. And when John says in the beginning was the Logos, he's letting them know right up front who he thinks Jesus is. Okay, in the beginning was the Memra. And if you want to really get that, I got Genesis 1:1 here from this same Targum. From the beginning, with wisdom, the Memra of the Lord created and perfected the heavens and the earth. And the earth was waste and unformed, desolate of man and beast, empty of plant cultivation and of trees. And darkness was spread over the face of the abyss, and the spirit of mercy from before the Lord was blowing over the surface of the waters. And the Memra of the Lord said, Let there be light. And there was light, according to the decree of his Memra. And it was manifest before the Lord that light was good. Okay, and so this being, person, I don't know, is found throughout Second Temple Jewish theology. There are other characterizations, and it's basically what they had kind of worked out was that Yahweh himself was far too holy for man to look upon, because he says that. You can't look at me, I'm too holy. That's what he says to Moses, right? Show me your glory. Well, I can't, but I'll let my backside pass before you. That's not, so the theology is there already. And so what they've done is, well, we know that in our Bible, There are several times where the malach, the messenger of the Lord, comes in, and then at the end of the scene, the character who experienced it says, I've seen the Lord. Well, is it a messenger or is it the Lord? Which one is it? Well, the way they work this out is, it's the memra. It's the logos. It's Metatron is another word they use in Greek. And so they kind of characterize this thing, person, being, and this is where, we think Christian Trinitarianism began in Constantinople 300 years after Jesus or whatever. The idea is getting knocked around in the first century. And they're worshiping two powers in heaven. Some of them are, some of them aren't. There's a fight about it. But they're worshiping a visible and an invisible Yahweh is kind of the essence of what's going on. Okay, so there's the manifest presence of God, who we call Jesus, but who John called the Logos. And Logos is not I know New Testament scholars, again, sorry, you need to spend more time in the Old Testament, but the New Testament scholars want to say, Logos is the founding order in Greek. That's neat in Greek philosophy. But it's also the Greek translation of memra. And so it's not too far off to say that John's probably hitting on his Jewish roots here. So this is a quote from a guy named Martin McNamara, who's kind of the guy for Targums. And he says, the designation for God most characteristic of all the Targums is the memra of the Lord. This is found 1,500 times in the various Targums. I'll just do that way. The Aramaic word memra comes from the root amar, to say. The word is found twice in the Qumran Targum of Job, in the sense of order or command, and is found also, even if rarely with its fundamental sense in the Targums. In general, however, in the Targums, memra is used as a buffer word, introduced apparently for some theological purpose, such as to avoid anthropomorphisms, which is human characteristics being ascribed to God, who says, I am not a man. To avoid making God the direct object or subject of actions created with creation, so that God is not created. And so anytime you have something in the Bible that seems like something of God is being created, they would use this memra. Okay, but memra also gets used for the glory. It gets used for Shekinah. It gets used for presence. It encompasses a lot. The expressed image of God is kind of what memra encompasses. And we know that language. Right, with Paul. And the writer of Hebrews, who is explicitly engaging Leviticus. Okay, and explicitly engaging some things that aren't in either Hebrew or Greek. So I think, did I just read everything? Yep, that's it. Okay, so what we have in Genesis 17 is the sign of the covenant with Abraham that goes on to the Jews. It's the circumcision. We all know that part. But also what we have here, if we look outside the Bible a little bit, is some of where we start to get our own New Testament and our own theology and stuff from. And the problem is, like I said, we get into this stuff and we jump into the New Testament. And it's good. There are good stories there. And we start reading, and we don't realize what these guys are actually doing. They're not just, there's arguments in scholarly world about did Paul think Jesus was God incarnate, or did he think that Jesus was just, seriously? The only reason they wrote about him is because they thought he was God. That's right. The kind of the foundation of it all. Did the church bring about the Bible, or the Bible the church? Well, the Bible was written to the church, so kind of means that the church was there first. And so this kind of stuff, we don't see it, we don't know it, we don't, we've never experienced, most of us. How many of you heard the word memra before? No. How many of you heard about Metatron? Baxter's teaching about Metatron up in Oregon right now. Yeah, Megatron. He's a transformer. No. Yeah. No, and you can look up, there's some good blogs out there written on memra, Metatron, and there's another one, I can't remember the name, and logos. And how these words that mean word or presence or whatever get personalized. And then that leads us to this New Testament where all of a sudden we've got a God who is incarnate. And that's not in the Old Testament. He doesn't say, I'm going to come through a woman. I mean, I know that shocks us. He says, I'll be one of you. I'll walk among you. I'll be your God and you will be my people. But he doesn't say, like, there's nothing about incarnation. Isaiah is not prophesying about Jesus. Some of Isaiah's prophecy fits Jesus, but that's different than it being directly about Jesus. I mean, that's a big one. We got to get hold of that. Biblical prophecy is not fortune telling. Madam Jesus does not exist. Yeah, I know. Charismatics hate it when I say stuff like that. Oh, you mean God won't tell us our future? Yeah, I mean God won't tell you your future. Because that's not how it works. We read these biblical books and we think, but they're foretelling the future. No, they're not. They're looking back at something that's already happened. Right. And prophecy in the Bible is looking back and saying, oh my God, what just happened? And Ezekiel says, well, you played the harlot at Yahweh's altar, so he wiped you out. Yeah. And people are like, oh, it's a prophecy. Yeah, and he's looking backward. You know? And it might be written like it's forward, but it's not. It's not. It's how they do it. It's how Daniel works. It's how Ezekiel works. It's how Isaiah works. Awesome. Looking back, always look. It's how Jeremiah works. I mean, look at all the prophets, right? Every single one of them. Amos, Hosea, Obadiah, all these guys. Something has happened, and then the prophet comes in. And he's like, boy, did you screw the pooch. Well, in Ezekiel's case, that's like literal. At Yahweh's altar. And that's why he brought the razor of Babylon against you. So like we see in this language, it's like, that's offensive. And yeah, it's offensive. We're like, but our God doesn't act like that. And it's like, that's neat. But look at what he's saying. Ezekiel's saying that they actually did that. So he's packaging some historical truth in to his prophetic utterance. And this stuff happened. And that to him, like, could you fathom like being in like Bethel, Redding, okay, big charismatic church, there's like a glory cloud or whatever that is, or a fog machine, and everybody's worshiping, and all of a sudden like 15 women get up on stage and start having sex with each other? Yeah, see, like we act like, oh, our God doesn't act like that, but then when you put it in our own terms, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, that's not right. You know, like, okay, I don't want God to kill them, but I understand why Ezekiel thought that Babylon had come against them. Because they were doing this stuff at Yahweh's altar. And not only that, if you really read the whole thing, they were going out and looking for other gods to fill the role that Yahweh specifically said he would fill. Yeah. I am the Lord your healer. Who has a healer God? And I mean, this is what they're doing. Yeah. And so Ezekiel's like just going after him, and he's being vulgar. I mean, in the Hebrew, he's swearing at them, and he's using foul words, and he's talking about what they're doing is so vile. But that's prophecy, okay? Not this, oh, the Lord says your business will succeed. No, that's Madam Jesus. And seeing a soothsayer is forbidden in the Bible. Lots. But that's what we want from the stage, because that's what sells tickets to the big show and books. Amen. You're dismissed.